Last year, the Supreme Court of Canada overturned the ban on doctor-assisted death. Since then, little legislative progress has been made to clarify what kind of protocols or regulations will govern how Canadians will exercise this new right. Let's delve into this difficult topic with Maureen Taylor. She's co-chair of the Provincial Territorial Expert Advisory Group on Physician-Assisted Dying. She's also a physician assistant at Toronto East General Hospital. We welcome Sylvia Miracle, Executive Director of the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres, Supriya Dwivedi, consultant with Crestview Strategy, and Michael Corin, the author and columnist for several publications, including the Toronto Star. And it's good to have everybody here in this studio. And can I just, let me give a little extra props here to Maureen Taylor, who used to work in this building.
Yes.
A few years ago.
In a broom closet.
Not quite in as nice a studio as this, but it's so nice to see you again, and
it's
lovely to have you back at TVO.
Thank you.
While you've got the floor, let's get you to just sort of set up the background on this story for us, if you would. The case, Carter versus Canada, is where this all started. Help us understand the background.
Yes, I think forever forward, the Carter decision is what we'll call it in Canada. Kay Carter was one of the patients involved in that case, a woman who was suffering intolerably. Pay attention to these words because they'll come up again. Who had an incurable condition, illness, and who wanted some control over how she was going to die. And when it came to the Supreme Court, it was a unanimous decision that those parts of the criminal code which make it illegal for someone to help another person commit suicide are no longer valid when it involves a physician who is helping someone with a grievous and irremediable condition, who is experiencing intolerable suffering, who wants to end their life. And so going forward, when those conditions are met, Canadians will have the right to this.
Now, you have academic credentials on this, but you don't come to this purely from academic standpoints.
No.
You have a personal connection to this. Remind people.
My late husband, Dr. Donald Lowe, who was sort of like the SARS doctor, was diagnosed, it's just coming up 3 years ago, with an inoperable brain tumor. And being a physician, and I work in healthcare, we knew what that meant right away. And he knew that as his death neared, he would lose lots of abilities, lots of functions. And right away, when you look at my journal, you can see that I note that he asked me to look into Switzerland about a week after his diagnosis. So he died 7 months later. And even though we researched it extensively, I was unable to help him have a physician-assisted death. Even someone with his connections, there was no way to do it. So he made a video 10 days before he died that I asked him to make. And, you know, he was not responsible for the Carter decision. Those were those other very brave women from BC. But I like to think that when his video became public and he was speaking to other physicians who were, by and large, very opposed to this before, when Don was alive, I like to think that it moved that bar a little bit and that we have more of an acceptance in the medical community toward this now.
It did seem to offend his sense of fair play that he didn't get to choose the means by which he wanted to depart this world.
And he was
in
dying
Canada.
anyway, right? And so he said, what is the point of making me suffer right to the bitter end when there's no need?
Supriya, we've got 5 senators and 11 members of parliament named to a parliamentary committee that are going to report to the federal government on how the legislation on all of this should be crafted. And the report's due the end of next month. Does all that sound reasonable to you in terms of trying to figure this whole thing out?
Well, I mean, there's definitely a time crunch there, and I don't envy any of the senators or MPs who've been named to that committee. You know, it concerns me a little bit that they will get their work done on time, but I think they understand that there is definitely a time crunch there and that the whole country is watching them, and that I'm on the optimistic side.
Optimistic of what?
Of them getting it done in time and doing it right, because I think the Liberals really know that this is, you know, when they asked for the Supreme Court for the extension, I think they're aware of the fact that there are Canadians currently suffering that do not have access to, you know, physician-assisted dying, and that they realize the gravity of their work right now.
Sylvia, the process by which we're figuring all this out, does it work for you?
We have a tendency, I think, to perhaps it's part of a national identity, as we constantly are looking in Canada for what's our own identity, which is to ask the question, ask the questions, ask the questions. I think that there is a lot of information. I think there's a lot of evidence. I think that we can always consider issues of faith, of personal exercise and expression. And you know, I come from an old community, as you know, in terms of we didn't bring a lot of social mores over here, and so it's not as though it's a foreign concept to us that people in situations when all avenues have been exhausted, that in order to make sure that they go, in the 70s we still were the dying with dignity concepts, but, and they have support for that. And so, is it a hurry up, as you've suggested? Yeah, we've got to make a decision, but these decisions are long thought out and long researched, and I think it's now a question of trying to find that space that's comfortable for all of us about how we proceed.
Well, here's some of the latest research, which I have right here. Maureen, this may look familiar to you.
Yep.
I think this
all
is your group.
All 62 pages.
All 62 pages with lots of recommendations. We have this as the latest of many reports, the Provincial Territorial Expert Advisory Group on Physician-Assisted Dying. That's Maureen Taylor's group. Michael Corin, let me get you into this. Do we need the federal government to launch another investigation when this was delivered last November, and presumably, you know, everybody kind of by now knows where they stand on this, don't they?
I don't think everybody does, but remember, procrastination is purely political. It's not just Canada. All of the civilized world has been considering this for a generation. We have the evidence, we know what we're doing, we know what other countries have done. In fact, we're in a privileged position because we can judge by other countries and draw conclusions from their failings and their success. But people are nervous. We had a Conservative government with a caucus that contained quite a few people who were opposed to any form of euthanasia. I mean, I've said this in the past, I'll say it again, the alternative to dying with dignity is not living, it is dying without dignity. And I think there's a consensus now, the vast majority of people who want some move. The argument is how much movement, how much control. I think it has to be colossal. There must be a great deal of control and supervision. But we can do that. I'm not here to say, well, we are the greatest country, we'll get it right. But I think we have perhaps a unique opportunity to do better than anybody else in enabling people who are dying and who want their last remaining short period of time to have some sort of dignity. And learning from the mistakes that were made elsewhere. This is not about mass euthanasia. This is about listening to Canadian people, as a democracy is supposed to do, and doing the job properly. But I do understand the nervousness. We get very excited about, I don't know, maybe Kevin O'Leary running for the Conservative leadership, or Senate reform, or changing the electoral system. This is, and I'm very careful about my language, this is literally about life and death.
This is life and death.
So we have to get it right. We do have enough time. The idea that there's not enough time, that's not, we already have enough time. This is about putting a certain political packaging and wrapping on what is a decision that most people, as you say, have already made.
We don't normally talk about people's personal lives on this program, but I did ask Maureen about her husband, and I want to ask you about your dad. How has your experience with your father affected your views on this?
He didn't die well. I'm not really even sure what a good death is. I hear the phrase a lot, I read it a lot, but my dad had, and he was a very robust man. He was a tough man, he'd been a very talented boxer, and he was in the RAF in Bomber Command. And after his first stroke, it wasn't too bad. And then he had a second stroke, and he was in a terrible condition.
How old was he at the time?
He wasn't old, he was in his early 70s. He wasn't even 74. And the doctor said to us, look, we found cancer too, and if he does recover from this stroke, which we doubt, we would strongly advise that we don't operate. I think it would be unfair. And in the end, he died of pneumonia. And I have struggled with this because part of me, maybe lots of me, is glad, because it would have been a very difficult decision to make. There was no one apart. There were good doctors in the UK trying to help us, but they weren't trained in this area. And the problem, and most people watching now have something similar, either directly or vicariously through another relative that they've gone through this, is that it's not that there are bad people, it's that what should actually be mass agreement has been polarized by people who've made this an issue of religion or politics, when it's at heart an issue of humanity.
Sylvia, let me ask you, because we often hear that respect for elders is something that your culture is particularly attuned to, maybe more than other cultures. I think that's fair to say. Does assisted death conflict with that respect?
You know, it doesn't. If I don't want to suggest there's a pan approach amongst nations, but I will tell you, you know, my own late father, who was 85 and a veteran and equally as robust and conscious, had a series of strokes. And in between periods of time when he could tell us or communicate with us in a way that he wanted us to know that he didn't, his own words, I just don't want to lay around here and take up space. So we were able to make sure that, you know, all his notions were addressed, fortunately. And mind you, he was in a chronic care facility by then. But he chose to what we refer to ceremonially as fast, go without food and water. And they assured us, medical people as well as our traditional people, that he had a great peace with him, that there's a little bit of discomfort, but as you go. So I think there is a great deal of respect. It is about people who've lived their lives, but it's also, you know, people who have, as we know from the research, really very significant health problems for which there isn't a recovery. And I don't think we're just saying it's a notion of, you know, I feel like this today. So it is a progressive process, and the family really needs to be engaged in this. We shouldn't think otherwise, but we need to be engaged. We shouldn't be the impediments to something that someone's wishes are. And I think that we're going to need a healthcare system, if they're going to do it, who's open to other people being involved, who maybe don't have medical credentials, but have ways of supporting both the process, the people who are engaged in it, who are giving the care, and families of people who are leaving us.
Let me follow up with Maureen on this. When you did your work on this report, I presume you saw numerous different ethnic communities who may have different ways of reacting to this issue. What'd you find out?
You know, we did reach out to stakeholders, but I'm always leery of allowing an association to say they speak for all their members, unless they've done a very recent poll. But we did reach out to First Nations communities, sort of South Asian communities and everything. And many of them say that we cannot speak with one voice, exactly what you're saying. I will say on the issue of remote and Native communities, what we heard from the territorial governments as well as Ontario, where we have remote communities where there is no physician in a remote community, that they said, you're going to have to allow other healthcare providers like a nurse, sometimes we have a nurse, you're going to have to allow the telemedicine kind of things that we already do now when we don't have doctors. And so that's why we spend a good deal of time in the report acknowledging that this is going to be an issue of access for these. But I'll ask you, one thing we did hear, physicians who are the single physician in a largely Aboriginal community are concerned that if it's known that they will do this, they'll be shunned by the community, afraid that no one will want to come to them. And I just want to ask you if that's a realistic fear.
Well, I suppose if it's your fear, it's realistic. But my answer to you generally is that there are conversations, and there are language issues, right? All kinds. I'm not just talking about us as Indigenous communities, about how are we going to frame this? How are we going to talk about it? And I think that we need the regulations very clearly that Michael's talked about, and certainly the report talks about. So I believe that it is a longer term discussion. I mean, probably the short answer, if there is one, is we're suspicious of everything that outsiders are doing to us lately.
Right. Yes.
Period. And so this is one more notion. We're now going to regulate it. I mean, we were suspicious when midwives had to go to college. Like, what the heck? We've been doing this forever. So we've been helping our people cross over forever, too.
You know what I noticed? You put Maureen Taylor in a TV studio, she can't help but want to host the show. It's hilarious. Okay, Supriya, come on in on this.
Well, I think when we're talking about different, ethnic communities or what have you, it's important to also realize that nobody is forcing anybody to undergo this procedure. So it reminds me very much of the marriage equality debate. If you don't like gay marriage, don't get gay married. And in this situation, that sort of applies as well. I understand we have to, we're a pluralistic society and we should definitely value input and consider everybody's opinion. But at the end of the day, this is really a choice between one person, their family, if they'd like to consult with them, and their physician. And I don't think any one person or community or organization should really have a say in standing in the way of that.
Do you have a sense, though, about whether, let's just take the South Asian community, for example, whether the South Asian community has a particular view on this that would be distinct from any other community's view?
I mean, that's a really good question. I wonder about that because we talked about respect for elders. I would actually argue that in the South Asian community, it's more of a deference to elders. So in that situation, I'd be really curious to look at the data. I don't know, Maureen, do you have any insight into that?
Data, but I think that it's going to take a couple generations probably before this can even be discussed around the dinner table. Some of them said.
Well, why is that, Maureen?
Oh, I think for a lot of the reasons, Sylvia already said the language is hard. People who lived, the Jewish community, remembering what euthanasia meant in World War II, that specter hangs over. That's why I tend to, although I agree with you, Michael, this qualifies as euthanasia, but I tend to use the physician-assisted dying just to try, and I don't use suicide either, to try to distinguish it from these other things.
If I may, just to address that point, I think it is different from the marriage equality debate because there are people in vulnerable communities who do fear certain consequences. And it's people with disability and handicap.
Sure, absolutely.
And so we do have to listen very, and that community actually is quite divided. There are some who are very frightened of any even discussion of this, others who are willing to embrace. But I think we have to be very empathetic. When it comes to people elderly, we used to, you mentioned reverence, and it's not just South Asian and Native and African, and if you travel the Middle East, you see endless houses with flat roofs. It's because they're building extensions where the grandparents will live. But from a time when we did revere the elderly as these great mansions of wisdom, we tend now to see them as slums that have to be demolished. There is a lack of respect. So there are social pressures. The person who may believe, well, I've had a good innings, haven't I, and now I'm just eating up the pension, with staying in a home, and maybe it's time to go. So it does involve more than just the people who make the decision, I think.
Sure, but just for an example, it's very commonplace for a traditional South Asian family to have a joint family structure in which then the bride would then move into the husband's house with his parents and so on and so forth. So in those situations, I'm wondering if, in terms of you're also the primary caretaker for your in-laws, how that factors into this debate.
Caregiver, you mean?
Caregiver.
Primary caregiver.
Yeah, caregiver.
Well, what we've said in our report, and I think that the parliamentary committee in Ottawa will agree, is only the patient can ask for this. No substitute decision maker should ever be able to ask. And I don't know if that has implications for the situation your dad was in, Michael, but if he lacked the capacity after his stroke to ask for this, out of luck. So just out of luck.
So I think it is about creating this space for conversations, and we've all had to be brave, whether it's in our families talking about gay lesbian issues that a long time ago when I was young coming out we didn't talk about. But I think I think the media plays an important role, and I think the very fact, Steve, that we're talking here about end of life and assisted dying, as opposed to the word suicide, which is a popular, if not the headline, the banner under it before you get into it, is our language around this, being respectful, opening the sort of space for it is important. And I think the media play an enormous role in helping us have, I don't want to suggest it's not an emotional discussion, but a rational discussion with emotions in it.
Let's, Sheldon, let's bring these couple of graphics up, shall we? Here's our good friend Michael Coren writing in the Toronto Star last October, saying, for a nation as progressive and authentically liberal, small l, as Canada, our lack of movement on this issue has been disastrous. And much of this can be attributed to a previous government beholden, if not completely sympathetic, to a Christian right obsessed with the issue. It's one of the big three for them, of course, often the only three. No to abortion, no to gay rights, no to euthanasia. Because they have lost the first two, they are fighting like zealots to defend the last. Get off the fence, Coren. Tell us what you really think. One more graphic here. This is Ipsos Reid. This is from fall of 2014. 80% of all Christians support assisted dying. including 83% of Catholics. Nearly all atheist or agnostic Canadians did, that's 96%. Those citing no religious identity, 95%, show support for assisted dying. Now those numbers, and that's from a year and a half ago, don't sound like an obsessed no to euthanasia.
Oh, I think you'll find I use the term Christian right, and I stand by it, and those numbers don't surprise me at all. First of all, as you look, this country is 48% Catholic. Vast majority of those people never see a church, and if they do, it's Christmas and Easter. You know, everyone here knows, the Catholic voice, the Catholic response will come from the Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Magisterium, and I guarantee you they will be absolutely opposed to any sort of movement. It'll come from the Evangelical Right, from the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, and the same will apply. I stand by what I said, those groups will oppose. And what you had in the Tory caucus, less in cabinet, but in the caucus, you had a large number, several dozen, evangelical in particular, and some Catholic MPs who wanted no discussion at all about this issue.
Do you think that's an indefensible point of view?
I understand the point of view, but I reject it, because, and I think semantics are important here. You mentioned suicide. Now, think how the Catholic Church has changed its view of suicide, by the way. I mean, it was regarded as a terrible sin. Now we understand
you couldn't
the
be
context.
buried in a Catholic cemetery.
Exactly. So that's changed radically. Yeah. But I think, and I mentioned this earlier, it's based on a misunderstanding of what we're talking about here. This is not about choosing certain people who don't fit in. It's not about someone saying, I really don't feel very good today. It's about someone who is going to die within a fairly... Look, in the Netherlands, for example, a third of the people who apply are told, no, you don't qualify. A third are accepted. A third die before the decision is made. That's how close they are to death. These are people who are dying. They just don't want to die in agony and fear without any sort of control. That's all we're talking about, a very small number. What offends me about some on the... Well, let's just use Christian right, because it is most, is that they're not willing to listen to that. They've made it a question of ideology, not actually based in the Christian faith, but in an ideological interpretation of the Christian faith.
All right, let's play a clip now. We did have a debate on this program in November 2014. Susan MacDonald, President, Canadian Society of Palliative Care Physicians. Here's a clip of what she had to say on that program. Roll it, please.
Most palliative care physicians currently feel that euthanasia or assisted suicide really isn't part of palliative care, that it's something separate, and that our job is to help people with the emotional, physical, psychological suffering that occurs when you have a life-threatening condition, but that the piece of suicide or assisted suicide or euthanasia would be something quite separate. So the majority of our membership, and I'm talking 85 to 90%, are not in favor at this time.
Okay, Mo, you're a physician assistant, so you've seen some of this firsthand.
We just had this discussion at my hospital this morning. First of all, the survey, when she says our members, currently, I think she's talking about a 2010 a survey that they did.
Correct.
I think if she did it today, she would find that there's been movement on that. I'm not saying the majority. Oh, more in favor. Because we all know palliative care physicians who are saying, I do think this should be one option of many at the end of life. I heard that this morning in my hospital. So I get palliative care's fear, because it's taken them so long to become an acknowledged part of the medical care and not be looked at like the Grim Reaper. I still see patients, as soon as we mention palliative care to them, the family goes, well, you're just giving up on them. And that's not true. Early palliative care is very important. You can still get some treatments beyond palliative care involvement, but I get that. But at the same time, I wish the palliative care associations would see that we're not talking about euthanasia and suicide here. We are talking about people, as Michael says, who are dying anyway.
So does this happen? Pull the curtain back a little bit, because you're in the hospitals now and you see how this really works. Don't doctors and families just basically unofficially make these decisions now anyway? If
you think that happened, don't you think I would have got that for Dawn? This is a big fallacy. I've worked in medicine now 6 years in emerge and now in infectious disease. Yes, morphine in very high doses can probably suppress breathing, but we don't know how much it would take to do that for Sylvia or Michael or you. It would be different. It doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. If it could, I would have done it and you wouldn't even know about me. And I wouldn't be here tonight talking to you because I would have just done it.
I would just add,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say about the palliative care docs. I'd be also interested to hear from medical oncologists and neurologists or neurosurgeons who also have to see their patients suffer undue harm and intolerable sort of pain. I'd also like to point out that I'd be curious to know, and Maureen, you may know about this a little bit more than I do, but if there's a generational divide in terms of doctors or med students. So if med students nowadays are more open to it, or first-year residents as opposed to those who have an established medical practice.
I attended the CMA meeting last, I guess it was the end of the summer, and I found that exactly the medical students and residents who were there were very in favor of this. I will say though, when on the other hand, aside from in the public, when I speak publicly about this, the people who attend are all have gray hair, and they're older, and they want this. So they're the ones pushing this forward. Is my parents' generation and me.
In our remaining time here, let's put up one more graphic if we can, Sheldon, and we'll put up. This is recommendation 13 from your report. It deals with giving early consent for physician-assisted death. Here's part of what you write, Maureen, in the report. A patient has been diagnosed with a condition that will remove competency, such as dementia, and has concerns about the quality of his or her end of life in that future. The patient is not experiencing intolerable suffering, but has been diagnosed with a grievous and irremediable medical condition. Should this patient be permitted to complete a patient declaration indicating that he or she would like to receive physician-assisted dying when certain conditions that the patient believes would constitute enduring intolerable suffering are met, even if the patient will no longer be competent when those conditions are met? Our answer is yes.
Tough one.
How'd you get to yes?
How'd we get to yes? I didn't go into this thinking that I would say yes in the end to that. I was thinking only about people like Dawn. But am I worried about getting a brain tumor? No. I'm worried about dementia. And living for, dementia is not it's not a fatal illness. You can live for many, many years. Yes, you can be a happily demented person. But at this point in my life, if I didn't know my children anymore, if I was bedbound in a nursing home, for me, that would not be quality of life. And if I have that diagnosis, I wouldn't want to have to end my life early, right? Under this law, I would have to end my life early before I get to the point where I lose the ability to say I still want this. So what we said is, if you outline very clearly in an advance directive what would for you qualify as intolerable suffering, and you've been sort of pre-approved because you have the diagnosis, it should be able to be carried out even if you lose competency.
Michael, you okay with that? Yes? You don't look like you're okay with that. Yes.
I know I should be able to give an absolute. I just don't know. My mum had dementia, and you know what? They didn't even know what it was. Was it Alzheimer's? Was it dementia? She wasn't the person I'd once known. So what? Then she fell asleep for 2 weeks. They said it wasn't officially a coma, but she fell asleep for 2 weeks and didn't wake up, and she was dead. Yes, I'm uncomfortable. It doesn't mean I'm saying no. I don't think I'm sufficiently informed, but viscerally, I do react. This person hasn't actually given consent. Do they feel within something different at this stage? I don't know.
We should always feel uncomfortable with all of this. I think that's the right thing. We should never go into this happy, right? So I think you're right to feel uncomfortable. I would be fine if the federal government wanted to take more time to study that one. Right. If we can't do that by June, let's not delay everything else and get hung up on that, but I think it should be considered.
But then also legally, we're looking at it being an inequality issue, because then those who are then diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's or what have you, then do not have access to this care, and that's sort of problematic to me, at least from a legal standpoint.
We're not going to satisfy everyone. So far, we're satisfying nobody, though, so any movement.
Did you have a kind of a visceral reaction to that recommendation?
No, my reaction was I strongly support it, and I think that given the comment about gray hair around this table, I should start pondering those things and not leave my partner or my nieces and nephews or whoever with decisions. We have a lot of discussions about ethical approaches to things and how we feel about it and what are just real justice notions, not the law, justice. And I'd be fine to have the conversation, and I'd be fine. I think I'm absolutely going to articulate that.
Conversation, yes. I'm just not sure what the answer will be at this stage.
Let me give the last 30 seconds here to Maureen Taylor to Sum up when you think we are going to see the Canada that you would like to see as it relates to this issue.
Well, apparently in Quebec, it's already arrived.
Right.
But I would say, and we talked about this at the hospital too, at first this is going to feel weird, if not for some people very wrong. But I think 5 years from now, when we have more experience in Canada, when we've worked out some of the bugs, I don't worry about the slippery slope. I'm like you, Michael. I think we've got that figured out from other jurisdictions. But I think you'll find more and more healthcare providers coming on side who maybe now don't see themselves involved. They will get comfortable with it. And I think it will become something we don't talk about so much anymore. Like in Oregon, apparently it's like, whatever.
I want to thank all of you for coming in and having such a beautifully thoughtful discussion about a really tough topic. Thanks so much to Michael Corn and Sylvia Miracle and Supriya Dwivedi and Maureen Taylor. Lovely to see you in TVO again, Maureen.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.